The wind howled like a wounded beast across the frozen tundra, carrying with it ice crystals, sharp enough to slice through exposed skin. Dominic Veroni stood at the edge of the small airstrip in Fairbanks, Alaska, watching as the last commercial flight of the day lifted off into a sky already darkening with the promise of something far worse than ordinary winter weather. He had received the call 3 hours earlier. His younger sister, Eleanor, had gone missing somewhere in the remote wilderness, north of the Arctic Circle. She had been working as a research assistant at a climate monitoring station, one of those lonely outposts where scientists measured ice thickness and recorded temperatures that would make most people question why humans bothered existing at all. The wind bit through his expensive wool coat, a garment designed for New York winters, not for the edge of the habitable world. Dominic had built an empire from nothing, had stared down rivals and federal prosecutors with equal indifference, had survived 3 attempts on his life before his 30th birthday. But standing here, watching the temperature gauge outside the small terminal building drop past -40, he felt something he had not experienced in years. Fear. Not for himself. Never for himself. But for Eleanor, the only person left in the world who still called him by his childhood nickname. The only one who remembered him before the violence, before the power, before the weight of an organization that moved billions through shadow channels. A bush pilot named Marcus approached him, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a parka that looked like it had survived multiple decades of Arctic service. His face was weathered, creased by wind and cold into something resembling aged leather. "The station stopped responding 2 days ago," Marcus said, his voice rough with the particular fatigue of men who lived at the mercy of nature. "Search and rescue sent a helicopter yesterday. They had to turn back. There is a pressure system moving in from Siberia. The meteorologists are calling it a once-in-a-generation event. We are looking at sustained winds over 100 miles per hour, temperatures that could drop to -90 with wind chill." Dominic did not blink. "When can we leave?" Marcus stared at him as if he had suggested they sprout wings and fly there themselves. "Did you hear what I just said? This is not a storm you survive. This is a storm that erases things, buildings, vehicles, people. We wait until it passes. How long? Could be 3 days, could be a week. The models are all over the place." Dominic reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope thick with cash. Marcus did not even look at it. "I have been flying these skies for 32 years, Marcus said. "I have seen men with more money than God freeze solid because they thought rules did not apply to them. Your money means nothing to weather. It cannot bribe physics. There is a woman out there who might still be alive. There are 4 researchers at that station. If the structure held they have supplies, they are trained for this. Best thing we can do is wait." Dominic turned away from the pilot and walked toward the terminal. Inside, a handful of travelers sat in plastic chairs, their flights cancelled, their plans disrupted by the approaching apocalypse of wind and ice. A television mounted on the wall showed satellite imagery of the storm system, a massive spiral of white consuming everything in its path. He made 3 phone calls. The first was to his second-in-command in New York, a man named Torres who had been with him since the beginning. Dominic explained the situation in clipped sentences, gave instructions for the organization to continue functioning in his absence, and ended the call without sentiment. The second call was to a private security firm that specialized in extreme environment operations. They confirmed what Marcus had already told him. No aircraft, no ground vehicle, no extraction team would enter that region until the storm passed. The third call was to a number he had not dialed in over a decade. It rang 6 times before a woman answered, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Catherine," Dominic said, "I need a favor." Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of history. Catherine Mercer had been his mentor in the early days, the woman who had taught him that power was not about violence, but about understanding systems, exploiting weaknesses, building networks that could survive any single point of failure. She had retired from the life years ago, disappeared into the Alaskan wilderness with money and silence. "I heard you were dead," she finally said. "Not yet. What do you need?" "My sister is stranded at a research station north of the Brooks Range. There is a storm coming that is supposed to last a week. I need to get to her. Another pause. When Catherine spoke again, her voice had softened slightly. The Brennan Station. I know it. About 200 miles from where I am now. Can you get me there? Can I? Probably. Should I? That depends on whether you have a death wish. She is the only family I have left. Catherine exhaled slowly, the sound crackling through the connection. There is a supply cache about 40 miles from my location. Old Cold War installation, decommissioned but still stocked. If you can get to my coordinates, I can outfit you with survival gear that might give you a chance. Might. Do you understand what that word means up here? I understand. No, you do not, but you will. She gave him coordinates, a set of numbers that meant nothing to him, but everything to the GPS device he would need to purchase. The nearest town with supplies was a 4-hour drive, assuming the roads remained passable. One more thing, Catherine said before ending the call. The person who goes into that storm may not be the same person who comes out. Even if you survive, something changes. The cold takes pieces of you that do not grow back. Are you prepared for that? Dominic ended the call without answering. The drive north took him through landscapes that shifted from merely harsh to actively hostile. Forests gave way to tundra, and the sky turned from grey to a deep purple that seemed to press down on the earth. He stopped in a town that consisted of perhaps 200 people and a general store that sold everything from canned beans to satellite emergency beacons. The owner, an elderly native Alaskan woman, watched him gather supplies without comment until he brought them to the counter. He had selected thermal base layers, a military-grade parka, boots rated to -60, chemical hand warmers, emergency rations, a portable shelter, rope, and a device that could theoretically summon rescue helicopters in clear weather. She looked at the pile of equipment, then at his face, then back at the equipment. Going somewhere you should not be going. I have to find someone. She nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied some internal calculation. The land up there does not care about your reasons, does not care about love or duty or money. It only knows what survives and what does not. You look like a man who has survived many things. Enough. Different kind of survival up there. She reached beneath the counter and withdrew a small pouch made of leather worn soft by years of handling. This belonged to my husband. He walked through a storm in 1962 that killed everyone else in his party. 12 men went in. He came out alone. He always said it was not strength that saved him, it was patience, the willingness to wait, to conserve, to let the land show him what it wanted him to do. Dominic took the pouch. Inside he could feel something small and hard, perhaps a stone or a piece of carved bone. What happened to him? Died in his sleep at 84 years old. After living a life most men could not imagine. She met his eyes directly. The storm does not care if you are brave or afraid. It only cares if you listen. He paid for his supplies and stepped back into the cold. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since he entered the store. On the horizon, the first leading edge of the storm system was becoming visible, a wall of darkness that stretched from the ground to the heavens. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this only happen when someone believes in the impossible. If you want to see what happens when a man walks into a storm that kills everything it touches, stay with us. Dominic drove until the road ended, then continued on a trail that grew progressively less defined until it disappeared entirely beneath a blanket of snow. He checked his GPS, confirmed his direction, and began walking. The first 3 miles were almost pleasant by Arctic standards. The wind had not yet reached its full fury, and the temperature hovered at merely dangerous rather than immediately lethal. His new boots crunched through ice, crust with each step, and his breath emerged in clouds that crystallized almost instantly. Catherine had said 40 miles to the supply cache. From there, another 160 to the research station, 200 miles through terrain that wanted him dead, during weather that would make that terrain seem hospitable by comparison. He thought about Elena as he walked. She had always been the dreamer in the family, the one who saw beauty in equations and wonder in data sets. When he had chosen his path, she had not judged him, had not asked questions she did not want answered. She simply continued loving him in her quiet, persistent way, sending postcards from whatever remote location her research took her, calling on holidays to ask about his health and happiness, as if he were just another brother with just another job. She was the only person who still believed there was something good in him worth saving. The wind began to pick up around mile 4. Dominic adjusted his hood, tightened the straps on his pack, and leaned into it. The snow beneath his feet grew deeper, requiring more energy for each step. He checked his watch, calculated his pace, and realized that at this rate, he would not reach Catherine before the main body of the storm arrived. He pushed harder. By mile 10, the world had transformed into something almost alien. The wind screamed across the tundra with a voice that sounded almost human, carrying snow horizontally at velocities that turned each flake into a tiny projectile. Visibility dropped to perhaps 20 feet, then 10, then less. The GPS in his hand showed him a direction, but the actual landscape had become featureless white in every direction. His face, despite the protection of his hood and face covering, began to feel the cold seeping in. First came numbness, then a strange burning sensation, then nothing at all. He stopped briefly to adjust his gear, turning his back to the wind, and realized that his fingers had lost significant dexterity even through his insulated gloves. 20 miles to Catherine, 20 miles through conditions that were already approaching the edge of what his equipment could handle, and the storm had not even fully arrived. Dominic thought about the choices that had led him here, every betrayal, every hard decision, every night when he had lain awake wondering if the price of power was worth what it cost. He had built something that would outlast him, an organization that moved and breathed and adapted like a living thing. But standing here in the absolute indifference of nature, none of that mattered. He was just a man made of heat and hope, trying not to become another frozen monument to human hubris. He kept walking. The temperature continued to drop as darkness fell. Dominic had packed a headlamp, but the driving snow made it nearly useless, reflecting the light back into his eyes until the world became a churning white void, punctuated by brief glimpses of terrain. He navigated by GPS alone, trusting the satellite connection to guide him through a landscape that offered no landmarks. At mile 15, he stumbled and fell. The snow cushioned his landing, but getting back up required effort that left him breathing heavily into his face covering. Ice had begun to form on his eyelashes, and each blink threatened to seal them shut. 5 more miles. He repeated the number like a prayer, like a spell that could somehow bend reality to match his will. 5 more miles. To Catherine. To shelter. To a chance of reaching Eleanor. 5 more miles through wind that had become a physical presence, a force pressing against him with the weight of an entire continent of cold air descending from the pole. His thoughts began to drift, and he recognized the early signs of hypothermia. The cold was stealing his concentration, making everything seem distant and slightly unreal. He forced himself to focus, to count his steps, to maintain the rhythm of movement that kept his core temperature above the threshold of collapse. 1,000 steps, 2,000, 3,000. The world narrowed to the simple mechanics of survival: lift foot, plant foot, lean into wind, repeat. Nothing existed beyond this basic formula. No past, no future, no organization, no enemies, no allies. Just the next step, and the next, and the next. When the light appeared ahead, Dominic thought at first it was a hallucination, his mind creating comfort where none existed. But it grew brighter as he approached, and then he could make out the shape of a structure, low and solid against the wind. Catherine opened the door before he could knock, her face lit by the warm glow of kerosene lamps. She grabbed his arm and pulled him inside, then slammed the door against the howling darkness. "You actually made it," she said, genuine surprise in her voice. "I had maybe 40% odds on you freezing to death out there." Dominic tried to respond, but his jaw had locked from the cold. Catherine guided him to a chair near a wood-burning stove, helped him remove his outer layers, and began the slow process of warming his extremities with water that felt scalding but was probably barely lukewarm. The main body of the storm arrives in about 6 hours, she said as she worked. "What you walked through was just the appetizer. If you want to reach your sister, we need to talk about what comes next." Dominic felt sensation returning to his fingers in waves of fire. He looked at Catherine, at the lines that decades of hard living had carved into her face, and saw something that might have been respect. "Tell me," he managed. "First, you rest. Then you eat. Then we plan. And then, if you still want to walk into the worst storm this region has seen in 50 years, I will show you how to do it without dying." Catherine sat down across from him. "Fair warning. Even with everything I know, even with the best equipment, your chances are maybe 1 in 3. Then I will be the one." Catherine smiled, the expression carrying equal parts admiration and sadness. That is exactly what they all say. Right before the cold teaches them humility. Outside, the wind continued to build, and the storm gathered itself for an assault that would test the limits of everything Dominic thought he knew about survival. Catherine's shelter was a masterpiece of practical engineering, half buried in the earth and reinforced against the kind of winds that could lift vehicles and throw them like toys. The interior was cramped but functional, every surface covered with the accumulated tools of Arctic survival. Maps lined one wall, marked with routes and danger zones and cache locations known only to those who had spent lifetimes in this unforgiving landscape. Dominic sat by the stove, feeling his body slowly return to something approaching normal function. The numbness in his extremities had given way to aching warmth, and his thoughts had sharpened from the fog of early hypothermia into clear, cold calculation. "Elena is at Brennan Station," he said. 160 miles from here." Catherine nodded, stirring something in a pot that filled the small space with the smell of meat and vegetables. Brennan is one of the more isolated outposts, built in the 70s for climate research. The structure itself is solid, designed to withstand exactly this kind of weather. If the station held, your sister and the other researchers have supplies for at least a month. Then why has no one heard from them? Communication equipment could have failed, power outage affecting the satellite uplink, storm interference, a dozen explanations that do not involve the worst-case scenario. Catherine looked at him directly. "But you are not here because you want reassurance. You are here because you believe something is wrong that waiting will not fix." Dominic met her gaze. "Elena called me 3 days ago, before the storm was even predicted. She said something had happened at the station, something that frightened her. She would not give details on the phone, but she asked me to come, and you dropped everything. She is my sister." Catherine was silent for a long moment, her attention apparently focused on the stew, but Dominic could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. She was assessing him, measuring his determination against the reality of what he was proposing. "The storm will peak in about 48 hours, she finally said. "Wind speeds of 120 miles per hour or more. Temperatures that will drop to -70 before wind chill, possibly lower. Visibility will be 0. GPS signals may become unreliable due to ionospheric disturbance. Even with the best equipment, exposed skin will freeze in under 60 seconds. You will be traveling through conditions that will kill any rescue party that tries to follow you if something goes wrong. I understand." "No," Catherine said firmly. "You understand the words. You do not yet understand what they mean. Let me be very clear about something. I have lived in this region for over 20 years. I have survived 3 storms that claimed other lives, and what is coming makes those seem gentle. If you walk out that door tomorrow, there is a very real probability that you will die. Not a small probability, a significant one." Dominic leaned forward. "What would you do if it was someone you loved out there?" Catherine stirred the stew slowly, not looking at him. "I would do exactly what you are doing, which is why I have not tried harder to stop you." She stood and walked to a cabinet, withdrawing what looked like a journal bound in weathered leather. "But I would also make sure I understood what I was facing." She set the journal on the table between them. This belonged to a man named Erik Larsen, Norwegian explorer. He attempted a solo crossing of this region in 1967 during a storm not unlike the one coming. His body was never found, but his journal was recovered from a cache he established. Partway through his journey, Dominic opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with dense handwriting, observations and calculations and maps, interspersed with personal reflections that grew increasingly fragmented as the entries progressed. He made it about 70 miles before the storm became too severe to continue, Catherine said. His last entries describe hallucinations, muscle failure, equipment frozen solid. He was an experienced Arctic traveler with decades of knowledge, and the storm still defeated him. What makes you think I can succeed where he failed? Catherine sat back down, her expression unreadable. Because you have something he did not have. He was traveling for glory, for the achievement of proving it could be done. You are traveling for love, and in my experience the land can sense the difference. She reached across the table and closed the journal. That does not mean love will save you. Plenty of people have died trying to reach those they love. But it changes how you approach the challenge. Erik Larson was trying to conquer the storm. You will need to move with it, through it, let it carry you as much as you fight against it. How do I do that? That is what the next 6 hours are for. Catherine stood and moved to another cabinet, this one filled with equipment that gleamed with purpose. First, we replace everything you brought with gear that might actually keep you alive. Then, I teach you what I know about reading storms, finding shelter, conserving energy. And then we talk about the route. She withdrew items one by one, explaining each as she set them on the table. A parka designed for polar expeditions, rated to temperatures that seemed more theoretical than real. Boots with multiple insulation layers and a vapor barrier system. Gloves that could be operated in stages, allowing precision work without complete exposure. Face protection that covered everything except the eyes, with chemical warmers that could be activated to prevent the moisture of breath from freezing. Your equipment from the store was adequate for the conditions you faced getting here, she said. It would have failed within hours in what is coming. This gear gives you a fighting chance. Dominic examined each piece, noting the quality and the weight. How did you come by all this? Catherine smiled slightly. When I left the life, I did not leave empty-handed. Some of that money went into building this shelter. The rest went into preparing for the day. When someone might need what I could offer, I did not expect that someone to be you. Why did you leave? She paused in her preparations, and Dominic saw something flicker across her face, a shadow of old pain or perhaps old wisdom. Because I looked at what I had built and realized it would consume me if I stayed. I had become something I did not recognize, someone who saw people as pieces on a board to be moved and sacrificed. She met his eyes. You are not there yet. I can see it in how you talk, about your sister, how you are willing to throw everything away on the chance of saving her, but you are closer than you might think. Dominic absorbed this in silence. He had always known that Catherine had left for reasons she never explained, had simply vanished one day with enough resources to disappear permanently. Now, sitting in her shelter at the edge of the world, he understood something about her choice that he had never grasped from a distance. The storm saved me, Catherine continued. I came up here thinking I would hide, but what I found was something else. The land strips away everything unnecessary. All the games, all the power plays, all the carefully constructed identity. Out here, you are either capable of surviving or you are not. Nothing else matters. She resumed laying out equipment, her movements efficient and practiced. If you survive this journey, you may find the same thing. The storm has a way of showing you who you really are when everything else is taken away. Over the next several hours, Catherine taught him things that no book could convey. How to read the density of snow to predict coming conditions, how to identify the subtle signs that indicated dangerous terrain beneath a uniform white surface, how to construct emergency shelter using nothing but his body and the snow itself, how to manage his energy expenditure to maximize distance without exhausting his reserves. She made him practice setting up the portable shelter in the warmth of her cabin until he could do it blindfolded, his hands moving through the motions automatically. She drilled him on the signs of frostbite and hypothermia, on the protocols for treating them in the field, on the brutal calculus of when to push forward and when to stop. Most people who die in these conditions die because they refuse to stop, she said. They convince themselves they can make it just a little farther, push through just one more hour, and then they cross a line they cannot come back from. The storm does not care about your schedule. If it demands that you shelter for 12 hours, you shelter for 12 hours. Fighting against that is how you lose. And if sheltering means I do not reach Eleanor in time, then you do not reach her. Catherine's voice was hard but not unkind. I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because your sister needs you to arrive capable of helping. A man who pushes through the storm and arrives with frostbite so severe he cannot use his hands is not a rescue. He is another victim. Dominic nodded, accepting the logic even as something in him rebelled against it. He had built his life on the principle that determination could overcome any obstacle, that will was stronger than circumstance. The storm was teaching him a different lesson, one he was only beginning to understand. Catherine walked him through the route, pointing out the landmarks he might be able to identify, the cache locations where previous travelers had left emergency supplies, the terrain features that could provide shelter if he found himself caught in the open. There is an abandoned research station at the 40-mile mark, she said, tracing the route on her worn map. Decommissioned 10 years ago, but the structure should still be standing. If you can make it there on the first day, you can shelter during the storm's peak and continue when conditions ease. And if I cannot make 40 miles. She showed him 3 other potential shelter points, smaller caches with emergency supplies, locations where the terrain created natural windbreaks. None was as good as the abandoned station, but each offered a chance at survival if reaching the primary destination proved impossible. The storm will begin to ease after about 48 hours, Catherine explained. Not immediately safe, but survivable for someone with your equipment. That is your window. Get as far as you can before the peak, shelter through the worst of it, then cover the remaining distance while conditions are still difficult but not lethal. 160 miles, 2 days of travel through the worst weather imaginable, with a 48-hour pause in the middle. Dominic did the math and did not like the numbers. It can be done, Catherine said, reading his expression. I am not promising it will be done, but the possibility exists. She handed him a small device, compact and rugged. This is a satellite messenger. It can send a distress signal even when other communications fail. If you activate it, a rescue team will attempt to reach your location as soon as the weather permits. She paused. Which might be days after you need help. Do not rely on it. It is a last resort, not a safety net. Dominic attached the device to his pack, feeling the weight of it, understanding what it represented. Her acknowledgement that help might come too late, that the choice to go forward was truly a choice to face the storm alone. When do I leave? He asked. In 6 hours. Catherine glanced at a barometer mounted on the wall. The storm's forward edge will pass through here at dawn. There will be a brief period of relatively calm conditions before the main body arrives. That is your launch window. Miss it, and you will be trapped here until the storm passes. She turned back to him, her expression softening slightly. Get some sleep. Real sleep, not just resting. Your body needs to build reserves for what is coming. I will wake you when it is time. Dominic lay down on the cot she indicated, surrounded by gear and maps and the accumulated wisdom of someone who had chosen solitude over power. He closed his eyes and tried to quiet his mind, to let his body draw what strength it could from these remaining hours of warmth and safety. Outside, the wind continued to build, and somewhere in the frozen darkness his sister waited for someone who might never arrive. Dominic opened his eyes to Catherine, shaking his shoulder. The light inside the shelter had changed. The kerosene. Lamps now supplemented by a grey glow seeping through the small windows. Dawn, or what passed for dawn in the Arctic winter. The forward edge has passed, Catherine said. You have about 2 hours before the main body arrives. After that, visibility drops to nothing and stays there for at least 2 days. Dominic rose and began putting on the equipment she had prepared. Each layer served a purpose, each piece designed to work with the others, in a system that could mean the difference between life and death. Catherine checked his work, adjusted straps, tested seals, and made small modifications that years of experience told her were necessary. Remember what I told you, she said as he finished gearing up. "The storm is not your enemy. It simply is. Your job is not to defeat it, but to exist within it, to find the spaces where survival is possible and move through them." She handed him a flask filled with hot liquid, heavily sweetened. "Drink all of this before you go. Calories are currency out there, and you need to start with as much as possible." Dominic drank, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. He looked at Catherine, at this woman who had once helped build something vast and dangerous, who had walked away from power to find something else entirely. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Catherine considered the question. "Because I remember what it was like to love someone enough to do impossible things. Because you came here prepared to die for someone who matters to you, and that kind of love deserves whatever chance I can give it." She paused. "And because when I left I told myself I was done with that world forever. Helping you feels like proof that I still can." She opened the door, and the cold rushed in like a living thing. The sky outside was the color of old bruises, purple and grey churning together, and the wind had dropped to what felt almost manageable after the previous day's punishment. "The abandoned station is 40 miles due north," Catherine said. "The E. Terrain is relatively flat for the first 20 miles, then you hit the foothills. That is where it gets dangerous. Wind channels through the valleys, creates drifts that can bury a man in minutes. Stay on the high ground when possible." Dominic stepped outside, and the cold wrapped around him immediately, probing for weaknesses in his gear, testing every seal and seam. He took a breath, felt the air burn in his lungs despite the face covering, and understood at a cellular level what he was about to attempt. "If you do not make it," Catherine said from the doorway, "I will make sure word reaches your people. They will know what happened and why. I will make it." She smiled, the expression carrying decades of understanding about hope and its limitations. "Go then. And if you see something that looks like a path through the storm, something that seems too easy or too clear, be suspicious. The land lies when it is killing you." Dominic turned and began walking. Each step was a commitment, a choice that could not be undone once the storm closed behind him. He did not look back. The first 10 miles passed in a state of focused endurance. The wind was strong, but not overwhelming, and visibility remained reasonable. He could see the terrain ahead, could pick his path through the snow with some degree of precision. His GPS showed him moving steadily in the right direction, each mile marker a small victory. He thought about Elena as he walked. Her voice on the phone 3 days ago, the fear that had crept into her usual calm. She had never been one to dramatize, had always approached problems with scientific detachment. For her to ask him to come, to risk the journey across the country and into this frozen wilderness, something had to be seriously wrong. The research station had been her dream posting, a chance to study climate patterns in one of the most pristine environments on Earth, to contribute data that might help predict and prevent the worst effects of a warming planet. She had called it her cathedral, the place where she could serve something larger than herself. Now that cathedral had become a prison, surrounded by a storm that would test every assumption about survival. At mile 15, Dominic noticed the wind beginning to change. The direction shifted, coming now from his left instead of directly ahead, and the intensity increased noticeably. He checked his watch. An hour and 40 minutes since leaving Catherine's shelter. The main body of the storm was arriving early. He increased his pace, pushing his body harder, trying to gain as much distance as possible before conditions deteriorated completely. The foothills Catherine had warned about were visible ahead, dark shapes against the churning sky, and he aimed for a gap that seemed to offer passage through. The wind hit him at mile 18 like a wall of frozen air. One moment he was walking steadily, the next he was staggering, his body physically pushed sideways by a gust that exceeded anything he had experienced. He dropped to his knees, letting the pack on his back act as an anchor, and waited for the gust to pass. It did not pass. It was joined by another and another, until the individual gusts merged into a continuous assault. The snow that had been falling gently began driving horizontally, each flake now a tiny projectile that stung even through his protective gear. Visibility collapsed. What had been 50 feet became 10, then 5, then nothing but white. Chaos in every direction. Dominic could not see his own feet. He could not see the terrain ahead. He could only feel the wind trying to push him down and hear its voice screaming in his ears like something alive and angry. If you are watching this story and feeling your heart race with every step Dominic takes, then you understand something important. Sometimes the most powerful journey is the one we take for someone we love. Leave a comment right now saying the words, "I will not give up," and see how many others watching feel the same way. That comment section might just surprise you. Dominic forced himself to stand, to orient himself using the compass on his wrist, to take one step and then another. The GPS in his pocket beeped intermittently, the signal weakened by the storm but not entirely lost. He checked it quickly, shielding the device with his body, and saw that he was still moving in roughly the right direction, 20 miles to the abandoned station, 20 miles through. Conditions that had exceeded even Catherine's worst-case predictions. He thought about stopping, about deploying the emergency shelter and waiting for the peak to pass. But something in him refused. Every minute he waited was a minute longer that Elena remained unreached. Every hour lost to caution was an hour that might make the difference between finding her alive and finding her frozen. The foothills rose around him, channeling the wind into devastating corridors of accelerated air. Catherine had warned him about this, about the way terrain could amplify already extreme conditions. He tried to stay high to avoid the worst of the wind tunnels, but the reduced visibility made navigation almost impossible. At mile 22, he walked into a drift that swallowed him to the chest. The snow had accumulated against an unseen obstacle, creating a trap that was invisible until he was already caught. He struggled to free himself, each movement exhausting, each second draining heat from his core. It took him nearly 10 minutes to extract himself. 10 minutes of burning calories he could not afford to lose. 10 minutes when the cold probed every gap in his defenses. When he finally climbed out of the drift and found solid ground, he was breathing heavily and his hands were trembling inside their gloves. 18 miles remaining. The next hours blurred into a single, continuous effort of will. Dominic moved through the storm like a machine, his mind narrowed to the simple imperatives of direction and motion. He did not think about Elena, did not think about New York, did not think about anything except the next step. The cold was no longer just an external force. It had begun infiltrating his body, stealing warmth from his extremities, making his joints stiff and his movements clumsy. He felt his thoughts beginning to fragment, coherent reasoning giving way to something more primitive. Keep moving. Do not stop. Keep moving. He fell 3 more times before reaching mile 35. Each fall was harder to recover from than the last. Each time he pushed himself back to his feet, some part of him wondered if this would be the moment when he simply could not rise again. The abandoned station appeared out of the white chaos, like a mirage. One moment there was nothing but driving snow. The next there was a dark shape, angular and solid, fighting against the storm. Dominic staggered toward it, his legs moving through pure mechanical memory, his mind barely registering the reality of what he was seeing. The door was frozen shut. He pounded on it with fists he could barely feel, his voice lost in the wind's roar. For a terrible moment, he thought he would die here, within sight of shelter, unable to cross the final threshold. Then something gave. The ice cracked, the door shifted, and Dominic fell into darkness that was somehow colder than the storm outside, but blessedly still. He lay on the floor for a long time, his body shaking with exhaustion and the beginnings of serious hypothermia. The abandoned station was not warm, had not been heated in years, but it blocked the wind and stopped the relentless drain of body heat. That alone might be enough to save his life. Eventually, he found the strength to move. The station was small, just a few rooms designed for temporary research operations. Most of the equipment had been removed when it was decommissioned, but some emergency supplies remained, cached against exactly this kind of scenario. He found blankets, stiff with cold but functional. He found chemical heat packs, dozens of them, and activated as many as he could manage with fingers that barely responded. He found rations, frozen solid, but calories nonetheless, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by heat packs, eating frozen granola bars that tasted like salvation. Dominic allowed himself to hope. 40 miles covered, 120 remaining. The storm's peak would pass in 48 hours, maybe less. He had made it this far. He had survived what Catherine had warned might kill him. The rest was just more of the same. More miles, more cold, more determination. Outside, the storm howled its fury, but inside the abandoned station, a man who had built an empire on will and intelligence began planning the next phase of an impossible journey. Dominic slept in fits and starts, his body too cold for true rest, but too exhausted to remain fully conscious. The abandoned station groaned around him, metal and ice protesting against the wind's assault, but the structure held. Whatever Cold War engineers had designed this place, they had built it to endure. He woke properly after what his watch told him was 8 hours, though it felt like both longer and shorter. The storm outside continued unabated, the wind maintaining its screaming intensity, but Dominic felt stronger than he had when he arrived. The heat packs had done their work, and the rations had given his body fuel to burn. He moved through the station, exploring rooms he had barely registered the night before. The main research space was empty, stripped of any valuable equipment, but a small room at the back still contained a collection of supplies that made his heart lift. More food, more heat packs, a medical kit with supplies for treating cold injuries, and most valuable of all, a detailed topographical map of the region covering the distance between here and Brennan Station. Dominic spread the map on a table and studied it by the light of his headlamp. The terrain between here and Elena's location was more varied than what he had already crossed. Mountain passes, frozen river valleys, and areas marked with the ambiguous notation, "Extreme Caution." Each feature was a potential death trap in these conditions, but the map also showed him something useful, an alternate route that avoided the worst of the mountain terrain, following a frozen river valley that ran roughly parallel to the direct path. It would add, perhaps, 15 miles to the journey, but would keep him in lower elevations where the wind might be slightly less devastating. He traced both routes with his finger, weighing time against risk. The direct path was shorter but exposed. The valley route was longer, but potentially survivable. In the end, he chose the valley. Arriving late was better than not arriving at all. The map also showed him other cache locations, smaller than this station, but potentially life-saving. 2 were along the valley, route old supply drops established decades ago for emergency use. If any of them still contained usable equipment, they could make the difference between success and failure. He spent the next hours preparing for the second leg of the journey. He redistributed his supplies, keeping what was essential and leaving behind anything that added weight without adding survival value. He replaced spent heat packs with fresh ones from the station's supply. He ate as much as his stomach would hold, forcing down calories he did not want because he knew he would need them. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, the barometric pressure inside the station suggested conditions were worsening. But Dominic had studied weather patterns enough to understand the basic principle. What went down must eventually come up. Pressure could not fall indefinitely. At some point, the storm would exhaust itself, and that point was approaching. He estimated 24 hours until the peak passed, perhaps another 12 after that, before conditions became merely dangerous rather than immediately lethal. That gave him a window of maybe 36 hours to cover the remaining 120 miles. The math was possible, but barely. He would need to average more than 3 miles per hour across terrain that had reduced his pace to barely 2 miles per hour during the approach to this station, and that was assuming conditions actually improved as predicted. Elena was worth the risk. She had always been worth everything. He thought about their childhood, about the years before his path diverged into darkness. They had grown up poor in a neighborhood where poverty was the least of your concerns. Their father had died when Dominic was 12, leaving their mother to work multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. Elena, 3 years younger, had retreated into books and studies, building a world of order and logic against the chaos outside. Dominic had taken a different approach. He had learned that the chaos had rules of its own, that power flowed to those willing to seize it. By the time he was 20, he had begun building what would become his empire. By 25, he controlled significant operations across 3 states. By 30, he was someone whose name inspired fear and respect in equal measure. Through all of it, Elena had remained his compass, not judging, not approving, simply existing as proof that another way was possible. When she had won her research position, had flown to Alaska to study ice cores and climate data, Dominic had felt a strange mix of pride and loss. She was doing something that mattered, something that made the world better rather than simply taking what it offered. Now she was trapped in a frozen fortress, surrounded by a storm that cared nothing for her contributions or her dreams. He would reach her. There was no alternative that his mind was willing to entertain. The hours passed slowly in the abandoned station. Dominic forced himself to rest even when sleep would not come, knowing that his body needed recovery time before the next ordeal. He read through what remained of the station's logbooks, records of researchers who had worked here decades ago, their observations about weather and wildlife and the strange beauty of a land that was simultaneously deadly and magnificent. One entry caught his attention. A researcher named Dr. Sarah Chen had written about a particularly severe storm in 1987, describing how she and her team had been trapped at this very station for nearly 2 weeks. Her account of the psychological toll was almost more harrowing than the physical descriptions. "The cold becomes part of you," Dr. Chen had written, "not an enemy but a companion, something you learn to live with rather than fight against. The worst moments are not when the wind is screaming. They are when the wind suddenly stops and you can hear the silence of a world that does not need you, that existed for millions of years before humans arrived and will exist for millions more after we are gone. In that silence, you understand how small you truly are." Dominic read those words and understood something about his situation he had not fully grasped before. He was not conquering the wilderness. He was negotiating with it, trying to find terms that would allow his passage without demanding his life in return. After 18 hours in the station, the wind began to change. The constant howl that had formed the backdrop of his rest decreased in intensity, the gusts becoming intermittent rather than continuous. Dominic checked his watch, checked the barometer, checked the barely visible conditions outside through an ice-encrusted window. The storm was beginning to break. He gathered his supplies, suited up in his gear, and prepared to enter the elements once more. The temperature had dropped further during the peak of the storm, and his breath crystallized instantly when he cracked the door. The world outside was transformed. Snow had accumulated in drifts 30 feet high in some places, reshaping the landscape into something almost unrecognizable. But the wind had dropped to levels that permitted movement, and visibility had improved to perhaps 50 feet, enough to navigate by map and compass. Dominic stepped out of the station and began the second leg of his journey. The valley route proved to be the right choice. The frozen river at its center provided a relatively flat surface for walking, and the surrounding hills blocked the worst of the remaining wind. Progress was slow but steady, each mile marker bringing him closer to Elena. At mile 10 of the day, he found the first cache location marked on his map, a small metal box buried under snow, its contents preserved by the cold that had threatened to take everything else. Inside, he found more rations, more heat packs, and a notebook left by some previous traveler with observations about the trail ahead. The notebook warned about a section of the valley where the ice covering the river was dangerously thin, a result of thermal vents beneath the surface that kept the water from freezing completely. Dominic studied the description carefully, memorizing the landmarks that indicated when to leave the river ice and travel along the bank instead. He continued on, the hours passing in a rhythm of steps and breaths, and the constant monitoring of his body for signs of cold injury. His feet ached with each step, his hands remained borderline despite the chemical warmers, and his face felt like a mask of frozen flesh. But he was moving, covering ground, closing the distance to Elena. The weak winter light faded toward afternoon, and Dominic pushed himself to maintain pace despite the growing exhaustion. The thermal vent section the notebook had warned about appeared on schedule, and he detoured carefully around it, watching for the telltale signs of thin ice, the slight coloration, changes that indicated danger beneath the surface. By the time darkness forced him to stop, he had covered nearly 40 miles, 60 remaining to Brennan Station. The storm had mostly passed, leaving behind deep cold and occasional gusts, but nothing like the world-ending fury of the previous 2 days. He deployed his emergency shelter, a compact structure that trapped body heat and provided minimal protection from the elements. It was not comfortable, was barely better than sleeping on open ice, but it kept the wind out and allowed his body to recover some fraction of its depleted reserves. Sleep came easier that night, exhaustion finally overwhelming the discomfort of his situation. He dreamed of Elena, of summers they had spent together as children, of the way she laughed when something genuinely delighted her. In the dream, she was calling to him across a field of snow, her voice carried on a wind that was warm rather than cold. He woke to find morning light filtering through his shelter, and the temperature barely improved from the night before. 60 miles to go. One more day of travel, perhaps 2 if conditions deteriorated again. Dominic packed his shelter, ate what remained of his rations, and began walking. The final approach to Brennan Station was marked by terrain that grew increasingly severe. The valley route had served him well, but it eventually gave way to open tundra, a vast expanse of frozen flatness that offered no protection from the wind that had resumed, blowing with significant force. Dominic leaned into the gale and kept moving. His body had adapted to the constant cold, or at least had found a way to continue functioning despite it. His mind had narrowed to essentials, thoughts coming in fragments rather than coherent streams, all of them oriented toward the single goal of reaching Elena. 40 miles to go. The snow beneath his boots had acquired a different character here, harder and more wind-packed than the softer accumulations of the valley. Each step rang with a crystalline crunch, the sound carrying across the empty landscape like signals into void. He saw no wildlife, no movement of any kind. The land had retreated into itself, waiting for the storm to fully pass before resuming its normal rhythms. At mile 20 of the day, Dominic noticed something on the horizon that was not wind or snow. A structure, low and rectangular, becoming visible as he approached. Not the main research station, which should still be 40 miles distant, but something else. An outbuilding, perhaps, or another decommissioned facility like the one where he had sheltered before. He altered his course slightly to investigate. Even a brief rest out of the wind could help conserve energy for the final push. The structure proved to be a weather monitoring station, automated and unmanned, but providing a small shelter from the elements. More importantly, it contained a radio antenna that sparked an idea in Dominic's mind. He examined the equipment, his hands clumsy in their gloves but still functional enough for basic operations. The radio was older technology, built to survive exactly these conditions, and after some experimentation, he managed to power it up using a battery system that still held charge. Static filled the small space. He adjusted the frequency, searching for any signal, any indication that he was not completely alone in this frozen wasteland. A voice crackled through the static, barely audible but definitely human. "Is there anybody out there? This is Brennan Station calling any available receiver. We have a medical emergency and are unable to reach rescue services. Please respond." Dominic grabbed the microphone with hands that trembled from more than cold. "This is a friendly receiver. Brennan Station. I am approximately 40 miles south of your location and approaching on foot. What is your situation?" The pause that followed stretched for long seconds before the voice returned, now colored with disbelief. "On foot? In these conditions? Who is this?" Dominic hesitated. The name he used in his professional life carried weight that could complicate situations. But this was not the time for games or protection. "My name is Dominic Verone. Elena Verone is my sister. I'm coming to get her." Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Verone, I do not know how you are doing what you are doing, but your sister is alive. She has been asking about you since the storm began. There was a problem here before. The weather hit, a situation that has escalated. We have one researcher with serious injuries and limited medical supplies. Our communications with the outside world failed on the first day of the storm. What kind of problem? The voice became cautious, clearly weighing how much to share. There was a conflict among the research team, disagreements about data, about procedures. It escalated beyond what anyone expected. Dr. Marcus Reed, our station commander, he made some decisions that put the team at risk. Your sister tried to intervene. Things became violent. Dominic's hand tightened on the microphone. Is Elena hurt? She sustained minor injuries protecting another researcher. The person who is seriously hurt is the one Dr. Reed was attacking when your sister intervened. Dr. Reed himself has been contained, but we are in lockdown protocols and unable to safely reach our full medical supplies. I am coming. 40 miles. I will be there as soon as physically possible. The voice on the radio carried something like awe. We will be waiting. And Mr. Veroni, whatever you had to do to get this far, please do not let it be for nothing. Your sister believes you are coming. It is the only thing keeping her calm. Dominic ended the transmission and stepped back out into the wind. 40 miles had never seemed so far and yet so close. Elena was alive. She was hurt, but alive. She was waiting for him. He began walking with renewed purpose, his exhausted body finding reserves he had not known existed. The cold was still brutal, the wind still relentless, but they had become abstract obstacles rather than immediate threats. His mind was already at the research station, already planning what would need to happen when he arrived. The hours that followed tested everything he had left. His feet blistered through their thermal protection. His hands lost feeling entirely and did not regain it. His face, despite the covering, developed the white patches that indicated frostbite, beginning its work. But he kept moving step after step, mile after mile. The sun touched the horizon and began to sink, painting the frozen landscape in shades of orange and pink that were heartbreakingly beautiful. Dominic barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the GPS coordinates that showed him creeping closer to his goal, the distance shrinking with each painful step. 20 miles remaining, then 15, then 10. The research station appeared against the darkening sky like a promise, fulfilled. Lights in the windows, smoke from a generator exhaust, the signs of human presence in a landscape that seemed designed to reject all life. Dominic staggered the final mile on legs that had stopped reporting sensation hours ago. He fell twice, rising both times through pure will, refusing to collapse within sight of his destination. The door opened before he reached it. A figure emerged, wrapped in cold weather gear, and moved toward him with speed that suggested urgency beyond mere welcome. The figure resolved into Elena, his sister, his compass, the person for whom he had walked 200 miles through conditions that should have killed him. She caught him as his legs finally gave out, her arms wrapping around him with strength that seemed impossible given her size. Her voice in his ear was exactly as he remembered it, warm and fierce and full of love. You came. Of course you came. You impossible, stubborn, wonderful man. Dominic tried to respond, but his voice had frozen along with the rest of him. He could only hold her, could only feel the reality of her presence, could only let the tears that had been waiting for 200 miles finally fall. Other hands helped them inside. The warmth of the station hit him like a physical force, almost painful after so long in the cold. People were talking, asking questions, checking his vitals, but none of it penetrated the simple, overwhelming fact of arrival. He had made it. Eleanor was alive. Everything else was details. They laid him on a bed in the station's medical bay, began the slow process of warming his frozen extremities, treated the frostbite damage that would leave scars but not claim any fingers or toes. Through it all, Elena stayed beside him, her hand in his, her voice providing a constant thread of connection. When he was finally able to speak again, his first words were practical. The man who hurt you. Where is he? Contained. Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. He had some kind of breakdown. Started destroying research equipment, then turned on the team. I could not let him hurt Dr. Chen. She hesitated. I did not know what else to do. He was going to hurt her badly. So I stopped him. You stopped him. Elena nodded slowly. I hit him with a fire extinguisher, hard enough to put him down. He has been locked in a storage room ever since, conscious but restrained. The team has been divided about what to do with him when rescue arrives. Dominic absorbed this information. His sister, the pacifist, the scientist who believed in words and reason, had taken violent action to protect someone else. The irony was not lost on him. You did what you had to do. I know. Elena met his eyes directly. That is what frightens me. It was so easy, in the moment, to decide that hurting him was worth protecting her. I always thought I was different from you. Not better, just different. Now I am not sure. Dominic squeezed her hand. We are all capable of protecting what we love. That does not make you like me, it makes you human. They sat together in the medical bay, siblings reunited against impossible odds, while outside the Arctic wind continued its eternal work of shaping a world that cared nothing for human drama or triumph. The storm had passed, but the cold remained, and the journey back to civilization would require its own set of miracles. But that was tomorrow's problem. For now, there was warmth and safety, and the presence of the only person who had ever made Dominic believe that love was stronger than fear. The days that followed were a complex negotiation between survival and healing. The research station had supplies enough for weeks, but the communication equipment remained damaged beyond the team's ability to repair. They were isolated, dependent on Dominic's satellite messenger to eventually summon rescue when conditions permitted. Elena introduced him to the other researchers, a diverse group that had been torn apart by the events preceding the storm. Dr. Sarah Chen, the woman Elena had protected, had sustained serious injuries that were slowly healing under the team's limited medical care. Two other scientists, a married couple named James and Maria Rodriguez, had managed to remain neutral during the conflict and now served as bridges between the fractured group. And then there was Marcus Reed, locked in a storage room, his meals delivered through a slot in the door. Dominic asked to see him, and Elena led him there with clear reluctance. The man behind the locked door looked nothing like someone capable of violence. He was thin, almost gaunt, with eyes that held the hollow quality of someone who had retreated from reality. He barely acknowledged Dominic's presence, staring instead at some point on the far wall. He was not always like this, Elena said quietly. He was a brilliant researcher, respected in his field. Something broke in him when his primary data set was compromised. Years of work, potentially lost because of a computer failure. He blamed the team, blamed the equipment, blamed everything except the fundamental unpredictability of working in extreme environments. What will happen to him when rescue comes? There will be an investigation, psychological evaluation. Depending on what they find, perhaps treatment instead of punishment. Elena's voice carried a complexity of emotion. I am angry at what he did, but I also pity him. He lost himself out here. The isolation, the pressure, the disappointment. Some people break under that weight. Dominic looked at the shell of a man who had caused so much pain and felt nothing but cold assessment. In his world, someone who threatened what he loved would face consequences far more permanent than psychological evaluation. But this was Elena's world, her colleagues, her ethics. You are right to pity him, Dominic finally said, but you are also right to be angry. Both things can be true. The following days established a routine. Dominic's injuries required continued treatment, and he submitted to Elena's care with patience he would not have shown anyone else. The frostbite damage on his face began healing, leaving patches of new skin that stood out pink against his weathered complexion. His hands regained full function, though the sensitivity would never fully return. In the evenings, the team gathered in the common room, and despite the trauma they had experienced, a kind of community began to reform. James Rodriguez played guitar, filling the space with music that seemed impossibly warm given their frozen surroundings. Maria told stories from their previous expeditions, accounts of wonder and discovery that reminded everyone why they had chosen this life. Elena and Dominic spent hours talking, sharing years of experiences that letters and phone calls had never adequately conveyed. She told him about her research, about the data that showed accelerating changes in ice patterns, about the urgency she felt to contribute something meaningful before it was too late. He told her carefully and in selected portions about his life. Not the violence or the power plays, but the moments of unexpected connection. The families his organization had helped when legitimate systems failed. The communities that depended on his protection. The complicated moral mathematics of existing in a world where clean choices were luxuries few could afford. "You are not the monster you think you are," Elena said one night. The northern lights, painting the sky outside their window in sheets of green and purple. "You made choices in a world that offered limited options. Some of those choices caused harm. Others prevented worse harm. The balance is something only you can calculate. And what does your calculation show? That you walked 200 miles through conditions that should have killed you to reach me." Elena smiled. "Whatever else you have done, whatever price you think you owe, that counts for something. Love like that is not the action of a monster." The rescue helicopter arrived on the 7th day after Dominic reached the station. The weather had finally cleared enough for safe flight, and a search team had been mobilized as soon as his satellite beacon became trackable. They evacuated the injured first. Dr. Chen strapped to a stretcher, her grateful eyes meeting Elena's as they loaded her into the aircraft. Marcus Reed went next, sedated and restrained, his future now in the hands of authorities who would determine what combination of treatment and consequence his actions required. The research team followed, James and Maria choosing to leave together, their expedition cut short, but their partnership intact. Eleanor watched them go, her expression carrying the weight of an experience that would shape her career and her understanding of human nature. Finally, it was just Dominic and Elena standing in the snow, the helicopter's rotor wash creating a localized blizzard around them. "What happens now?" Elena asked. Dominic looked at her, at this woman who had always represented the best parts of human potential, the capacity for hope and discovery, and choosing light over darkness. "I return to my life. You return to yours. But maybe we do not let years pass between conversations again. Maybe we remember that we are the only family either of us has left, and that some connections are worth maintaining even when they are difficult." Elena nodded slowly. "I would like that." She paused. "And Dominic, if you ever decide you want a different life, something that does not require walking through storms just to survive, I will help you find it. There are other paths, other ways to use what you are capable of." He pulled her into an embrace, the kind he had not allowed himself in decades. "Maybe someday, for now I still have responsibilities, people who depend on what I have built. I cannot walk away from that any more than you could walk away from your research." They boarded the helicopter together and rose into the Arctic sky. Below them, the research station grew smaller, a tiny point of human presence in an expanse of white that stretched to every horizon. The storm had reshaped the landscape, piling snow into new configurations that would persist until the next great disturbance. Dominic looked out the window at the territory he had crossed on foot, the impossible distance now compressed into minutes of flight. He thought about Catherine's warning, about the pieces of himself the cold had taken. She had been right. He was not the same person who had landed in Fairbanks a week ago, but the change was not entirely loss. Somewhere in those 200 miles, stripped of every comfort and pretense, he had found something he thought he had lost years ago. The capacity to believe that love was worth any cost, that some bonds transcended the calculations of profit and power, that even in his world of shadows and violence, light could still break through. Elena leaned against his shoulder, exhausted but alive, and Dominic understood that whatever came next, this moment would remain. The proof that when everything else failed, when the cold threatened to take everything, the warmth of human connection could still be kindled. If you have watched this far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying I have watched this far so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Hit that like button if this story touched your heart, and share it with someone who needs to believe that impossible journeys can end in reunion. Subscribe if you want more stories of love that defies every obstacle. We tell these stories because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that the cold does not always win. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching until the end. The helicopter banked toward civilization, leaving behind a wilderness that would never know what had crossed its frozen heart. Two siblings held each other against the vibration of flight, survivors of a storm that had tested everything they knew about endurance and love. And somewhere in the vast white expanse below, the wind continued to blow, patient and eternal, waiting for the next soul brave or desperate enough to walk into its embrace. 6 months later, Dominic stood on the balcony of his New York penthouse, watching the city lights flicker like earthbound stars. The winter had passed, and spring had arrived with the particular intensity that New Yorkers cherished after months of cold. His phone buzzed with a message from Elena. She had returned to Alaska to a different research station, one with better safety protocols and a team she trusted. Her work continued, measuring ice and tracking change, contributing her small piece to humanity's understanding of the planet they shared. The message was simple: thinking of you. The new station has excellent communication equipment. No more radio silence. Dominic smiled and typed a response. Stay safe. Call if you need anything. He knew she would, and he knew that if she called, if she needed him, he would go. No storm was permanent. No distance was insurmountable. Not when love was the compass guiding the journey. Below him, the city hummed with life and ambition, and all the complex negotiations that defined human civilization. His organization continued its work, the machine he had built functioning as designed, but something had shifted in how Dominic approached it. The cold had taken pieces, yes, but it had also given something back. A clarity about priorities, an understanding that empire meant nothing without someone to share it with. He had started making changes, small ones at first, then larger, directing resources toward legitimate businesses, reducing dependence on operations that put people at risk, building infrastructure that could eventually stand without the shadow economy that had funded its creation. It would take years, perhaps decades, but the direction was set. Elena's words echoed in his memory. There are other paths. He was beginning to believe she might be right. The night deepened over New York, and Dominic remained on his balcony, breathing air that smelled of spring and possibility. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own cold winds to navigate. But tonight, he allowed himself to simply exist in the moment. A man who had walked through the worst storm imaginable and emerged with something he had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope the end.